The dispatch tape had been boxed with 60 others in the basement of the Colton County Sheriff's Office, stored below pipes that sweated through every summer since the building's renovation in 2001. When Deputy Archivist Nora Phelps pulled the container marked 1995 to third quarter during a court-ordered records audit in October 2015, she assumed the reel-to-reel cassettes inside were routine traffic logs and domestic disturbance dispatches. She cataloged them methodically. The third tape she digitized was labeled July 14th to 15 in faded ink, and when she played the converted file through her headphones at her desk, she heard a woman say, in a voice barely above a whisper, "He's going to do something tonight. I know he will. My name is Jolene Maddox, and I'm married to a detective with this department. Please help me." The recording ran for 91 seconds. Dispatch responded with standard protocol questions. The caller gave her address. She described her husband, Brecken Maddox, by name and badge number. She said he had been drinking since noon and had locked all the exterior doors from the inside. She said she could not leave and that she was calling from the bedroom phone while he was in the basement. The dispatcher asked if the caller wanted an officer sent to the home. Jolene Maddox said yes. Then the line disconnected. There was no record of a unit being dispatched to the Maddox residence that night. Nora Phelps ran the name through the department's digital index. Jolene Maddox, née Bridwell, had been reported missing by her husband on August 2, 1995, 19 days after that call. The case had generated local news coverage for approximately 3 weeks. Jolene was 28. She had been married to Brecken Maddox for 14 months. She had no children, no prior history of disappearance, no known substance abuse, and no criminal record. She worked part-time at a veterinary clinic on Route 17. She left behind a car, a purse, clothing, identification, and a cat named Bishop that a neighbor eventually adopted. The investigation in 1995 had been handled internally. Brecken Maddox was questioned but never named a suspect. He told his colleagues that Jolene had been increasingly erratic, that she had talked about leaving Colton County to return to her family in West Virginia, and that he came home from work on August 1st to find the house empty. His account was accepted. No physical evidence of violence was found inside the residence. A detective from the adjacent county briefly reviewed the case as a professional courtesy and found nothing to contradict Maddox's statement. The missing person file remained open but inactive. By 1997, it was effectively dead. Nora Phelps listened to the recording 4 times. She noted the date, compared it against the original case file, and discovered that the July 14th call was never mentioned anywhere in the investigative record. No supplemental report referenced it. No officer noted a domestic complaint at the Maddox address. No follow-up was documented. Either the call had been ignored and never logged, or someone had ensured the documentation disappeared. She brought the tape to Captain Darren Sykes the following morning. Sykes was a careful man who had joined the department in 2003 and had no personal connection to anyone involved. He listened, asked Phelps to make a verified digital copy, and then placed a call to the West Virginia State Police Major Crimes Unit. By the end of that week, the Jolene Maddox missing person case had been formally reopened under outside jurisdiction. Brecken Maddox had retired from the Colton County Sheriff's Office in 2010 with a full pension after 26 years of service. He was living 40 minutes south, in a brick ranch house near the Greenbrier River, with his second wife, Patrice, whom he had married in 2002. He had never been charged with any crime. He had never been publicly accused of any wrongdoing related to his first wife's disappearance. He had spent 20 years building a quiet, respectable life on top of whatever had happened in July and August of 1995. Now a dead woman's voice was asking for help from the department that had employed her husband, and no one could explain why that help had never arrived. Jolene Bridwell had grown up in a narrow valley outside Marlinton, West Virginia, the youngest of 3 daughters born to Holt and Vera Bridwell. Holt drove a fuel truck for a regional distributor. Vera cleaned houses for families in the area who could afford the help and raised vegetables she sold at a roadside stand from May through September. The Bridwells were not poor, but they navigated their finances carefully, and the 3 girls understood from an early age that college would require scholarships, savings, or both. The oldest, Daphne, married at 19 and moved to Virginia. The middle daughter, Gemma, studied bookkeeping at a community college and settled in Elkins. Jolene, who had been the most academically inclined, earned an associate degree in veterinary technology and took a job at the Colton County Animal Hospital in 1993. Drawn there partly by the job and partly by a friend from school who had an apartment in the area. It was through that friend, Lissa Kane, that Jolene attended a department fundraiser barbecue in September 1993 and met Brecken Maddox. Brecken was 31, a detective in the Criminal Investigations Division, broad-shouldered and attentive in the way certain men become when they have selected their target. He brought Jolene a drink before she asked for one. He walked her to her car. He called her the next day, and the day after that, and by the end of the month they were inseparable. Jolene described him to her mother as charming and old-fashioned. She said he opened doors and paid for everything, and told her she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Vera Bridwell later said she noticed something rigid behind the manners. A certain insistence on being in control of every plan, every evening, every decision. But Jolene was in love and not interested in caution. They married in June 1994 at a small church in Marlinton. Daphne served as matron of honor. Gemma did the flowers. Holt walked Jolene down the aisle and shook Brecken's hand at the altar with an expression that photographs would later make difficult to interpret, something between hope and unease. The couple moved into a house Brecken had purchased 2 years earlier, a 3-bedroom home on Crooked Elm Lane on the southern edge of Colton County. Jolene continued at the veterinary clinic. She adopted a tabby cat. She planted tomatoes in the backyard and talked to Lissa about getting a dog eventually, once Brecken warmed to the idea. The marriage, by all outward appearances, was stable and ordinary. But Lissa Kane would later recall that Jolene stopped accepting spontaneous invitations by late autumn of 1994. She always had to check with Brecken first. If she went out, she called home at specific intervals. She began apologizing for things that did not require apology, habit patterns that Lissa recognized but did not fully name at the time. When Lissa asked directly whether everything was all right, Jolene smiled and said she was just adjusting to married life. By spring of 1995, Jolene had reduced her hours at the clinic from 4 days a week to 2. She told her employer she wanted more time at home. Her coworkers noticed she had become quieter, more careful with her words, and that she sometimes arrived with redness around her eyes that she attributed to seasonal allergies. In late June, Jolene drove to Marlinton to visit her parents. She stayed for 2 nights and spent most of the visit sitting on the porch with her mother. Vera said Jolene talked about flowers and recipes and a novel she had been reading, but never once mentioned Brecken. When Vera brought up the marriage, Jolene changed the subject. When Vera pressed gently, Jolene said everything was fine and went inside to pour iced tea. It was the last time Vera Bridwell would see her youngest daughter. July 1995 in Colton County was brutally hot. The blacktop on Route 17 softened by midday, and the veterinary clinic ran its window units continuously. Jolene came into work on July 10th looking exhausted and jumpy, in a way her colleague, a vet technician named Dale Odom, found hard to ignore. When he asked if she was feeling all right, she nodded quickly and busied herself cleaning kennels. But during lunch, she sat alone in her car with the engine running and the air conditioning on, staring at the steering wheel. Dale later testified that he saw a bruise on the inside of Jolene's left forearm that day, partially covered by a long-sleeve shirt she had pushed up while washing instruments. He did not ask about it. He wished later that he had. 4 days after that, on July 14th, Jolene made the call to dispatch. The tape's audio, cleaned up by a forensic technician 20 years later, was remarkably clear. Jolene's voice was steady at first, practiced almost, as if she had rehearsed the sentences before dialing. Her composure eroded near the end, when she heard a sound somewhere in the house, a door closing or a footstep, and her final words before the line went dead were clipped, interrupted not by a scream but by a quick, measured breath, the sound of someone who had learned to make herself silent under pressure. What happened between July 14th and August 1st remained, for 20 years, an empty corridor of time. Brecken Maddox continued to report for work. His attendance log showed no absences during that period. He worked day shifts, clocked out in the early evening, and presumably returned home to the house on Crooked Elm Lane. No neighbor reported anything unusual. No disturbance calls were logged. On August 2nd, Brecken walked into the department at the start of his shift and told his sergeant that Jolene had left. He said he had come home the previous evening to an empty house. He said her clothes were still in the closet, her car was in the driveway, and she had not taken her purse. He said he believed she had gone to her parents' house and had probably gotten a ride from a friend, but when he called the Bridwell residence, they had not seen her. The sergeant took the report. A patrol officer was sent to the house. Brecken walked the officer through each room with practiced calm, pointing out the untouched purse, the keys on the hook by the door, the full closet. He appeared concerned but not frantic. The officer noted that the home was exceptionally clean. The cat was fed, the dishes were washed, the bed was made. Over the following week, the Colton County Sheriff's Office conducted what could generously be called a limited search. Jolene's photograph was circulated locally. Her family was contacted. Holt Bridwell drove from Marlinton to Colton County and spent 4 days looking for his daughter, knocking on doors, visiting the clinic, the grocery store, the gas station she frequented. He spoke with Brecken twice and later described those conversations as strange. Brecken was polite, cooperative, and entirely without urgency. He talked about Jolene as though she were a temporary house guest who had simply moved on. Holt asked to see the house. Brecken let him inside. Holt noticed that Jolene's personal items, her jewelry box, her Bible, a framed photograph of her mother, were still on her nightstand. He told the investigating officer that Jolene would never have left those things behind voluntarily. The officer noted the concern but took no additional action. By mid-August, the case had been effectively shelved. The department's position, never stated explicitly but understood by everyone involved, was that a young woman had walked away from a difficult marriage, and that she would probably surface when she was ready. She never surfaced. Vera Bridwell called the Colton County Sheriff's Office every month for 6 years. Each time she was told the case remained open and that there were no new leads. The calls became shorter. The voices on the other end became more impatient. By 2001, Vera was speaking to clerks who had never heard of Jolene Maddox and had to look up the case number while she waited. Holt Bridwell died of a heart attack in 2004, carrying the weight of his youngest daughter's disappearance like a stone sewn into his chest. Vera told Gemma at the funeral that the not knowing had killed him as surely as the blocked artery. It was the kind of statement that sounds melodramatic until you watched it happen over a decade, the way a man stops sleeping fully, stops eating with appetite, stops finding pleasure in the things that used to sustain him. Holt spent his last years rereading Jolene's old letters and driving past places she had been, looking for a pattern that was never there. Gemma Bridwell, the middle sister, handled grief differently. She filed records requests. She contacted the West Virginia State Police and asked them to review her sister's case. She wrote letters to the county prosecutor. She called private investigators, 2 of whom she could not afford and 1 of whom took a small retainer and produced nothing. In 2007, she created a simple website with Jolene's photograph, a physical description, and a contact email. It received a handful of messages over the years, none of which led anywhere. Daphne, the oldest, retreated into her own family and rarely spoke about Jolene. She told Gemma once that she had already mourned their sister and could not keep reopening the wound. Gemma did not blame her. Grief takes different shapes, and some people survive by sealing the door. Brecken Maddox, in the meantime, lived without visible consequence. He was promoted to senior detective in 1998. He served on a regional drug task force. He received a commendation for an arrest that led to the recovery of stolen firearms. In 2001, he began dating Patrice Nolan, a paralegal at a firm in Lewisburg. They married the following year. Patrice was reserved and practical, a woman who had been married once before and who valued stability above passion. She and Brecken attended church, maintained the yard, and kept mostly to themselves. When colleagues mentioned Jolene in passing during those years, Brecken responded with a rehearsed sadness. He would shake his head slowly and say he hoped she was alive somewhere, living the life she wanted. He never displayed anger. He never appeared nervous. He wore his former marriage like a faded scar, something he acknowledged but claimed had healed. His retirement in 2010 was unremarkable. A small gathering at the department, a plaque, a handshake from the sheriff, a speech about service and dedication. He drove home and became, to all appearances, a man enjoying his pension. He fished the Greenbrier River. He repaired a deck. He voted in every election and maintained his concealed carry permit. The world moved around Jolene's absence, filling the space with ordinary life, as though a young woman's disappearance were a minor disruption the community had absorbed and neutralized. Vera Bridwell continued her monthly calls to the sheriff's office until 2012, when her health began to decline and Gemma took over. By then, the calls were quarterly. By 2014, they had stopped altogether, replaced by an exhausted acceptance that no living institution was going to look for Jolene Maddox without something new forcing its hand. Something new arrived on an October morning in 2015, in a basement full of boxes that smelled like mildew and institutional neglect, and it arrived in the voice of a woman who had understood exactly what was about to happen to her. Nora Phelps was 34, methodical and uncomfortable with ambiguity. She had joined the sheriff's office as a civilian records specialist after 5 years cataloging documents for the county clerk, a job she had found intellectually numbing but stable. The archivist position gave her access to the department's institutional memory, decades of case files, logs, and recordings that no one had systematically organized. She approached the work with librarian precision, and the dispatch tape marked July 14 to July 15, 1995 was, in her professional estimation, the most significant thing she had ever found. After Captain Sykes made the referral to the West Virginia State Police, the case was assigned to Sergeant Owen Hale, a major crimes investigator based in Charleston with 22 years on the force. Hale was 51, divorced, and possessed of a quiet tenacity that his colleagues respected even when it made him difficult to work with. He did not rush. He did not speculate publicly. He read every document twice before forming a preliminary theory, and he had a particular talent for detecting the shape of what was missing from a file. Hale drove to Colton County in the second week of November 2015. He spent 3 days in the sheriff's office reviewing the original case file, which was thin to the point of negligence. The initial report contained Breckin Maddox's statement, a brief narrative from the responding officer, and a supplemental sheet from a detective named Virgil Henson, who had been assigned the case and had conducted exactly 4 interviews before writing a closing memo that read in part, "No evidence of foul play. Recommend continued monitoring." Hale noted that Virgil Henson and Breckin Maddox had been partners in the Criminal Investigations Division for 3 years prior to Jolene's disappearance. He noted that Henson had not documented any conflict of interest disclosure. He noted that Henson had not interviewed Lissa Kane, Dale Odom, or any of Jolene's family members in West Virginia. He noted that no forensic examination of the Maddox home had been performed. He noted that Jolene's car had never been processed for fingerprints or biological evidence. He noted that the missing person flyer distributed by the department used a photograph that was 3 years old and did not resemble Jolene's appearance at the time of her disappearance. He also noted the dispatch tape's absence from every document in the file. If a woman had called 911 describing a domestic threat from a law enforcement officer and no unit was dispatched, that failure had to be either catastrophic incompetence or intentional suppression. Hale requested the dispatch staffing schedule for July 14th. The dispatcher working that night shift was a man named Curtis Wentz, who had worked for the department from 1988 to 2005. Wentz had died of liver cancer in 2011. Hale sat in the records room for a long time after reading that detail. The dispatcher who had taken Jolene's call was dead. The detective who had investigated her disappearance had retired to Florida in 2008. The husband had retired with honors. The original sheriff who oversaw the department in 1995 had died in 2009. Every person who might explain why a terrified woman's call for help had vanished from the record was either gone or insulated by time and institutional distance. But the tape itself was alive. Hale obtained a forensic-quality copy of the dispatch recording and had it authenticated by an audio specialist at the State Police Crime Lab. The specialist confirmed the recording was consistent with equipment and tape stock used by rural dispatch centers in the mid-1990s. There was no evidence of editing, splicing, or alteration. The voice identified as Jolene Maddox was continuous and uninterrupted. The dispatcher's responses were procedurally standard. The call lasted 91 seconds and terminated abruptly from the caller's end. Hale listened to the tape in a quiet room with the door closed. He played it 7 times. On the 3rd listen, he began noting not just the words but the acoustic environment behind them. He could hear a low hum consistent with a window-mounted air conditioning unit. He could hear what sounded like a television or radio at a distance, muffled through a wall or floor. And near the 60-second mark, approximately when Jolene paused and seemed to react to a sound, there was a faint mechanical noise that the audio specialist tentatively identified as a deadbolt engaging. That detail arrested Hale's attention. Jolene had told the dispatcher that Brecken had locked all the exterior doors from the inside. The sound at the 60-second mark could have been another interior door being locked, possibly the basement door that Jolene mentioned Brecken had gone down to. If Brecken was coming upstairs and locking the basement door behind him, that would explain Jolene's sudden silence and the abrupt disconnection. Hale contacted the Colton County Building Department and obtained the original floor plan for the house on Crooked Elm Lane. The home had a full basement accessible from an interior staircase off the kitchen. The master bedroom was on the second floor. The distance between the basement door and the bedroom was significant enough that Jolene might have heard the lock but not immediately footsteps, giving her a few seconds to end the call. He also learned that the house had been sold in 1997, 2 years after Jolene's disappearance. Brecken had listed it through a local agent without public comment. The buyers, a couple named Farley, had lived there until 2006 before selling to a family named Grote who still occupied the property. Hale made a note to request permission to examine the home, particularly the basement, but he understood he would need more than a 20-year-old phone call to obtain a search warrant. He turned his attention instead to the people who had known Jolene and Brecken during the marriage. Lissa Kane was still living in the area, now working as an office manager for a trucking company. Dale Odom had moved to Virginia but was reachable by phone. Gemma Bridwell was in Elkins. Virgil Henson was in Sarasota. Hale began with Gemma because he believed the family's perspective had been deliberately excluded from the original investigation, and because Gemma had spent more than a decade trying to make someone listen. When he called her on a Tuesday evening and identified himself, there was a silence on the line that lasted so long he thought the connection had dropped. Then Gemma said, very quietly, "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years. Her voice did not break. It was flat with the weight of sustained, deliberate patience, the sound of a woman who had carried something alone for so long that even relief felt like exhaustion. Hale told her about the tape. He did not play it for her. He described its contents carefully and asked her what she wanted to know first. Gemma said she wanted to know why nobody came when her sister called. Gemma Bridwell drove from Elkins to Charleston to meet Hale at the state police barracks on a Thursday in late November. She arrived with a banker's box in the trunk of her car that she had been maintaining since 1998. Inside were copies of every letter she had sent to the Colton County Sheriff's Office, the county prosecutor, and various state agencies. There were printouts of the emails she received through her website. There were handwritten notes from phone conversations with Jolene's former co-workers, neighbors, and a private investigator named Teague, who had done a few weeks of work in 2009 before running out of retainer. There were photographs of Jolene, not just the polished wedding portrait, but candid shots from family gatherings, holidays, and the last visit to Marlinton in June 1995. Hale went through the box item by item while Gemma sat across from him and drank the bitter coffee the barracks provided. She did not hover. She did not narrate. She let him read. The most significant item was a note in Gemma's handwriting dated March 2003. Summarizing a phone conversation with a woman named Renee Talbot. Renee had been a receptionist at the Colton County Sheriff's Office in 1995. According to Gemma's note, Renee told her that she remembered Brecken Maddox coming into the office on the morning of August 2nd looking perfectly calm, and that she had always found it strange because Brecken had told the desk sergeant Jolene was missing. Renee also mentioned, almost as an aside, that she remembered hearing office conversation weeks earlier, in July, about Maddox's wife calling in about something domestic, but that nothing ever came of it. Hale set the note down. This was potential corroboration that someone in the department had known about the dispatch call at the time, even if no formal record existed. Renee Talbot could be a crucial witness. Gemma told him Renee had moved to Ohio in 2004, and that she had been unable to locate a current address. Hale asked permission to take the note and make a copy. Gemma agreed but asked him to return the original. She had organized her box like evidence because she had always believed that one day it would need to function as exactly that. Hale also asked Gemma about the June 1995 visit, the last time anyone in the family had seen Jolene. Gemma had not been present. She was working in Elkins at the time and did not learn about the visit until Vera mentioned it afterward. But Vera had told Gemma something she found troubling. During the visit, Jolene had asked Vera whether the family still had the old camping trailer parked behind Holt's equipment shed, the one they had used for trips to Cranberry Glades when the girls were young. Vera said yes, it was still there, and Jolene had nodded and said nothing more. The question had seemed oddly specific, and Vera puzzled over it after Jolene's disappearance, wondering if her daughter had been considering somewhere to go. Hale wrote this down. It suggested Jolene may have been planning an exit, at least mentally, during those final weeks. But she had not left. Her car, her purse, her identification had all remained at the house. Whatever plan she may have been forming had either been abandoned or interrupted. Gemma also handed Hale a sealed envelope containing a single item she had never given to anyone. Inside was a birthday card Jolene had mailed to Gemma in April 1995. It was a standard card with flowers on the front. Inside, Jolene had written, "Happy birthday, Gem. I think about you every day. I'm sorry I haven't visited. Things are complicated here. I love you more than you know. Please remember that." The word please was underlined twice. Gemma said she had read it 100 times and always believed it was a message meant to say more than its surface allowed. Hale held the card carefully and understood he was holding not evidence in the forensic sense, but evidence of a woman trying to communicate through the narrow space her life permitted. Hale met Lissa Kane at a diner on Route 19 during the first week of December. Lissa was 47 now, heavier and wearier than the photographs from her 20s, but her memory was sharp and her willingness to talk was immediate. She said she had been waiting for someone official to ask her about Jolene since 1995. Lissa described the early friendship, the apartment they had nearly shared before Brecken entered the picture, the rapid courtship that pulled Jolene away from her social life. She said Brecken had a way of filling a room that felt exciting at first and suffocating later. He would arrive at the clinic to pick Jolene up, smiling, arm around her shoulders, and Jolene would tense almost imperceptibly. Lissa noticed but told herself she was imagining things. She had grown up with a father who controlled her mother's movements and spending, and she was perhaps too familiar with the pattern to trust her own recognition of it. By early 1995, Lissa said, Jolene had become a different person. She spoke less. She deferred to Brecken on everything, even trivial matters like where to eat lunch. When Lissa invited her to a movie in March 1995, Jolene said she would need to ask Brecken and then called back an hour later to say she could not go. The reason she gave was vague. Lissa did not push. Lissa also described a specific incident in May 1995 that she had never reported to anyone in an official capacity. She had stopped by the house on Crooked Elm Lane unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. Brecken's truck was not in the driveway, and Lissa assumed he was at work. She knocked on the front door. Jolene opened it only part way and did not invite her inside. Her left eye was swollen and discolored. She said she had walked into a cabinet door in the kitchen. Lissa stared at her for a long moment and said very carefully, "You can come stay with me any time." Jolene smiled thinly and said, "I know." Then she closed the door. Hale asked Lissa whether she had considered calling the police at the time. Lissa's expression shifted into something between guilt and bitter pragmatism. "Call who?" she said. "He was the police." Dale Odom, reached by phone in Roanoke, confirmed the bruise he had seen on Jolene's arm in July 1995. He also recalled that Jolene had asked him a peculiar question that same week, whether the clinic had any job openings in other locations, perhaps a sister practice or a referral. Dale told her the clinic was independent and did not have satellite offices, but he offered to ask around. Jolene thanked him and then asked him not to mention it to anyone, particularly not if anyone from the sheriff's office asked. Dale understood the implication and agreed. He never saw Jolene again after July 12th. Hale assembled these testimonies like bricks. No single account proved what had happened, but together they constructed a picture of a woman in escalating danger who had been systematically isolated from help, whose one attempt to reach law enforcement had been erased, and who had been looking for a way out in the weeks before she vanished. The question that remained was not whether Jolene Maddox had been in danger. It was what Brecken Maddox had done with the danger he controlled. Curtis Wentz had died in 2011, but he had not died without leaving traces. Hale tracked down his former wife, Sharon Wentz, who lived in a senior apartment complex in Beckley. She was 71 and reluctant to speak. When Hale identified himself and explained the reason for his visit, she sat in her recliner and folded her hands and said, "I always knew someone would come about that." Sharon told Hale that Curtis had worked dispatch for the sheriff's office for 17 years and had been, for most of that time, a reliable if unremarkable employee. He drank moderately, complained about the pay, and performed his duties competently. But in the summer of 1995, something changed. Curtis came home one night in late July, visibly agitated. He poured himself 2 whiskeys in quick succession and told Sharon he had done something he was not comfortable with. He would not elaborate. When she pressed, he said it was a work matter and that he had been advised to handle it a certain way by someone above him. Sharon said Curtis never named Breckin Maddox directly, but she recalled that he used the phrase, "one of the detectives," and that he muttered something about a domestic call that got handled off the books. She did not fully understand what he meant at the time. It was only after Jolene Maddox's disappearance became local news a few weeks later that Sharon connected the 2 events. She asked Curtis directly whether the call he had mentioned involved the detective's wife. Curtis told her to drop it and never brought it up again. Hale asked Sharon why she had never come forward. She looked at him with an expression that was neither defiant nor ashamed but simply exhausted by the geometry of her own survival. She said Curtis had told her that if she repeated anything he said about work, he could lose his job and his pension. She said she had 2 children in school at the time and no income of her own. She said she told herself it was not her responsibility. She said she had carried that decision for 20 years and it had cost her things she could not easily describe. Hale did not press her further on that point. He asked instead whether Curtis had left any written records, diaries, or personal notes about his work. Sharon said no. But she mentioned that Curtis had kept a locker at the department, and that when he retired in 2005, he brought home a small box of personal items that she had stored in the hall closet and never opened. She retrieved the box. Inside were a few pens, a coffee mug with the department seal, 2 outdated procedural manuals, and a pocket notebook with a vinyl cover. Hale opened the notebook carefully. Most of the pages were blank. On 3 pages, Curtis had written short notes in a cramped, slanting hand, shift reminders, phone numbers, a grocery list. But on the 4th page with writing, dated simply July 14th, Curtis had written 2 lines. DV call Maddox residence. Per VH. No dispatch. No log. Confirmed. VH Virgil Henson, the detective who had been Breckin Maddox's partner and who had later been assigned to investigate Jolene's disappearance. Curtis Wentz had been told by Henson not to dispatch a unit and not to log the call. The instruction was documented in Curtis's own hand, dated to the night of the call. Hale placed the notebook in an evidence bag and drove back to Charleston with the specific, focused intensity of a man who now had 2 pieces of physical evidence connecting a law enforcement conspiracy to the disappearance of a woman whose only crime had been asking for help. Hale presented his findings to a circuit court judge in early January 2016 and obtained a search warrant for the property at Crooked Elm Lane, which was now owned by the Grote family. The Grotes were cooperative if bewildered. They had purchased the home in 2006 and had no knowledge of its history. They had renovated the kitchen in 2009, replaced the roof in 2012, and finished a portion of the basement as a recreation room in 2013. The basement renovation was Hale's primary concern. If Breckin Maddox had harmed Jolene inside that house and concealed evidence, the basement was the most likely location. The home's original floor plan showed a poured concrete basement floor, cinderblock walls, and a single drain connected to the lateral sewer line. The Grote's renovation had added drywall, carpet, and a drop ceiling to approximately 2/3 of the space, leaving the utility area with the furnace and water heater unfinished. A forensic team from the State Police Crime Lab arrived on a bitter January morning. The Grotes temporarily relocated to a relative's home. The team began by removing sections of the drywall and the finished portion of the basement, working systematically from the east wall. Behind the second panel they removed, on the original cinder block, they found a series of dark stains that field-tested presumptive positive for blood. The staining pattern was consistent with low-velocity spatter, the kind produced by blunt impact rather than a gunshot or arterial wound. Further examination revealed that someone had applied a layer of paint over the original cinder block before the stains, and that the stains had seeped into the porous concrete despite an apparent attempt at cleaning. The forensic technicians also identified scoring on the concrete floor near the east wall that was consistent with heavy scraping, possibly from dragging a weighted object. Samples were collected for DNA analysis. In 2016, the state crime lab's turnaround time for priority cases was approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Hale used that interval to pursue the investigative threads that did not require laboratory confirmation. He drove to Sarasota, Florida, to interview Virgil Henson. Henson was 68, retired, tan, and immediately guarded when Hale showed his credentials. They sat on Henson's screened porch while Hale described the dispatch tape, Curtis Wentz's notebook, and the blood evidence in the basement. Henson listened without expression, his hands resting on the arms of a wicker chair. When Hale asked him directly whether he had instructed Curtis Wentz to suppress Jolene Maddox's dispatch call, Henson said he wanted an attorney present before answering any further questions. Hale had expected this. He thanked Henson, gave him a business card, and left. On the drive back, Hale called the Pocahontas County Prosecutor's Office to discuss the emerging case. The prosecutor, a woman named Diane Keller who had been elected in 2012 and had no connection to the original investigation, listened carefully. She told Hale that if the DNA confirmed Jolene Maddox's blood in the basement, they would have a foundation for charges against Brecken Maddox. But she also said, with the frankness Hale appreciated, that a 20-year-old case with no body, no murder weapon, and a primary suspect who had been a law enforcement officer would be among the most difficult prosecutions she could imagine. She told Hale to keep building. Hale interviewed Patrice Maddox, Brecken's second wife, in February 2016 at the Brick Ranch House near the Greenbrier River. Brecken was not home. He had left that morning to visit a friend in Lewisburg, and Patrice had agreed to speak with Hale alone after receiving his call the day before. She was 53, with short silver hair and the composed bearing of a woman who had spent her professional life in legal offices. She offered Hale water and sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded, mirroring Sharon Wentz's posture in a way that struck Hale as coincidental but also somehow structural. The stance of women who had organized their lives around a man's unpredictability and learned to hold themselves still. Patrice said she had married Brecken knowing about Jolene. He had described his first wife as unstable, possibly depressed, someone who had left without warning and without explanation. He said it was the most painful experience of his life and that he blamed himself for not recognizing the signs. Patrice had found this account sympathetic and self-aware. It made Brecken seem emotionally intelligent, a man who had suffered and grown from the suffering. Over 12 years of marriage, however, Patrice had accumulated her own observations. Brecken controlled the household finances entirely. He monitored her phone. He questioned her about conversations she had with coworkers. He objected when she visited her sister in Martinsburg, and once, in 2008, became so angry about a 2-day trip she had planned without his explicit approval that he removed the distributor cap from her car and told her the engine was having problems. She discovered the truth when a mechanic found nothing wrong with the engine but noticed the missing part. Patrice had never reported Brecken to the police. She gave Hale the same reason Lissa Kane and Sharon Wentz had given: the futility of reporting a law enforcement officer to his own institution or its local equivalent. Even after Brecken's retirement, the network of relationships he had cultivated over 26 years made the local departments feel unsafe. She said she had considered divorce several times, but that Brecken's response to even the suggestion of separation was disproportionate and frightening. He did not strike her, she said. He did something she found more disturbing. He became absolutely calm, sat down, looked at her with an expression she could only describe as blank appraisal, and said things like, "You don't want to do that, Patrice. I know how to make things very difficult." Hale asked Patrice whether Brecken had ever said anything specific about Jolene that contradicted his public account. Patrice hesitated. She looked toward the window and then back at Hale and said there was one incident. In 2010, shortly after his retirement, Brecken had been drinking on the back deck and Patrice had come outside. He was staring at the tree line and without prompting he said, "She thought she could call for help. That was her mistake." Patrice asked what he meant. He turned and looked at her with the blank expression she had described and said, "Nothing, I'm talking about a case." She did not ask again. Hale documented the statement and asked Patrice whether she would be willing to testify. She was quiet for nearly a full minute, then she said, "If you can guarantee my safety, yes. But I need to understand what guarantee means in practice, because in my experience the system protects the people who already have power inside it." Hale could not make the guarantee she wanted, and he respected her enough not to pretend otherwise. He said the state police would work with victim services to arrange relocation and protection if she chose to cooperate formally. Patrice said she would think about it. Hale left the house and sat in his car for several minutes, processing the specific cruelty of a man who had married a second woman and built the same cage around her with the same tools. Section 12. What the ground held. In late February, the DNA results returned. The blood recovered from the basement wall at Crooked Elm Lane was consistent with female origin. A comparison with a buccal swab voluntarily provided by Gemma Bridwell confirmed a sibling-level familial match. The blood in the basement belonged to Jolene Maddox or a close female relative, and since Jolene was the only member of her immediate family who had ever lived at or visited that address, the conclusion was effectively certain. Hale brought the results to Prosecutor Keller. They discussed the strength of the case, the dispatch tape, Curtis Wentz's notebook, the blood evidence, Lissa Kane's testimony about the black eye, Dale Odom's testimony about the bruise, and Jolene's inquiry about work elsewhere, Gemma's documentation, Sharon Wentz's account of Curtis's distress, and Patrice Maddox's recollection of Brecken's statement. It was a substantial body of circumstantial evidence, but there was still no body and no direct evidence of the mechanism of death. Keller wanted more. Specifically, she wanted to establish what Brecken had done with Jolene's remains. Hale returned to the Crooked Elm Lane property with a ground-penetrating radar team. They scanned the basement floor, the backyard, and a strip of land along the property's eastern boundary that backed up to a wooded ravine. The basement and yard scans showed nothing anomalous. But in the ravine, approximately 40 yards from the property line, the radar detected a subsurface disturbance consistent with excavated and refilled soil at a depth of roughly 4 feet. The excavation took 2 days. At a depth of 44 inches, the team recovered skeletal remains in an advanced state of decomposition, wrapped in deteriorated plastic sheeting. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office in Charleston. A forensic anthropologist determined the skeleton was that of a female between 25 and 35 years of age, approximately 5 feet 5 inches in height. The skull showed a depressed fracture to the right parietal bone consistent with blunt force trauma. Dental records obtained from Jolene's childhood dentist in Marlinton confirmed the identification. Jolene Maddox had been buried less than 50 yards from the house where she had called for help and been denied it. She had been there for 20 years while families moved in and out of the home above her, while children played in the backyard, while seasons layered fallen leaves over the spot where the soil had once been turned by a man who carried a badge and understood precisely how to keep a secret within a system designed to protect its own. Hale called Gemma Bridwell to deliver the news. He did it in person, driving to Elkins on a raw March afternoon. He sat in her living room and told her that her sister had been found, that the cause of death was blunt force trauma, and that the evidence supported criminal charges against Brecken Maddox. Gemma sat very still. She did not cry immediately. She pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed in a measured, careful rhythm, and then she asked Hale a single question. Did she suffer? Hale told her the truth, which was that the medical examiner believed the head injury would have caused rapid loss of consciousness. He could not know whether that was entirely accurate, but it was what the evidence supported, and Gemma deserved to hear it. She nodded once, very slowly, and then the tears came, not in a flood but in a series of quiet, deliberate contractions, the grief of a woman who had known the answer for 20 years and had simply been waiting for someone to say it aloud. Brecken Maddox was arrested on March 22, 2016, at the Brick Ranch House near the Greenbrier River. 4 state police officers served the warrant. Brecken answered the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses, looking for all the world like a retired man interrupted during a quiet morning. When Hale read the charges, first-degree murder in the death of Jolene Bridwell Maddox and conspiracy to obstruct justice, Brecken's expression did not change. He extended his wrists for the handcuffs with the practiced compliance of a man who had put those same restraints on hundreds of other people. He said nothing. Patrice was not in the house. She had relocated to her sister's home in Martinsburg 10 days earlier, assisted by a victim advocate from the state police. She had signed a formal statement describing Brecken's controlling behavior, the distributor cap incident, and the 2010 remark about Jolene calling for help. She would later testify at trial. Brecken retained an attorney named Monroe Flagg, a defense lawyer from Charleston with experience in high-profile criminal cases. Flagg's strategy, evident from the first pretrial hearing, was to challenge the chain of evidence and argue that 20 years of elapsed time had corrupted every physical element of the prosecution's case. He argued the dispatch tape, while authentic, proved only that Jolene had made a domestic complaint, not that any crime had subsequently occurred. He argued the blood in the basement could have resulted from any number of non-criminal events. He argued that the skeletal remains, while identified as Jolene's, could not be conclusively linked to Brecken through direct physical evidence. And he argued that Curtis Wentz's notebook, written by a dead man who could not be cross-examined, was hearsay that should be excluded. The judge admitted the notebook under a hearsay exception for records made in the regular course of business, finding that a dispatcher's contemporaneous notation of an instruction received from a named colleague met the standard. Flagg objected vigorously and preserved the issue for appeal. Flagg also sought to exclude Patrice Maddox's testimony about the 2010 statement, arguing it was an ambiguous remark that did not constitute an admission. The judge allowed it, ruling that the statement's meaning was a question for the jury. Meanwhile, Hale continued building the case. He obtained Brecken's personnel records from the sheriff's office and discovered 3 prior complaints of excessive force, all internally adjudicated and all resulting in findings of no misconduct. He obtained financial records showing that Brecken had canceled Jolene's credit card on July 28, 1995, 5 days before he reported her missing. He obtained phone records showing that no calls were made from the Maddox residence to the Bridwell family in West Virginia between July 14 and August 2, despite Brecken's later claim that Jolene had been talking about visiting her parents. The credit card cancellation was particularly significant. Brecken had called the issuing bank and stated that the card had been lost, but Jolene's purse, which contained the card, was found inside the house when officers responded to the missing person report. The card had not been lost. Brecken had deactivated it while Jolene was presumably still alive, according to his own timeline. The implication was that Brecken knew Jolene would not need the card, either because she was already dead or because he had already decided what he was going to do. Hale presented this evidence to Keller, who incorporated it into the prosecution's timeline. The case was set for trial in September 2016. The trial of Brecken Maddox lasted 9 days. The jury was drawn from an adjacent county to minimize local bias. Keller prosecuted with a methodical intensity that matched Hale's investigative style, building the case brick by brick, each witness adding a layer to the structure of culpability. Gemma Bridwell testified on the second day. She described her sister's personality, the family's concern during the marriage, the birthday card with its underlined please, and the 20 years she had spent searching for answers. She was composed and precise, and when Flagg cross-examined her about whether she had a personal grudge against Brecken, she looked at him steadily and said, "I have a personal interest in the truth. I don't think those are the same thing." Lissa Kane testified about the black eye and the closed door. Dale Odom described the bruise and Jolene's quiet inquiry about work in other locations. Sharon Wentz recounted Curtis's agitation and his reference to a domestic call handled off the books. A forensic audio expert authenticated the dispatch tape and played it for the jury. The courtroom was silent during those 91 seconds. Several jurors looked down at their hands. One pressed her lips together so tightly they disappeared. Patrice Maddox took the stand on the 6th day. She described 12 years of marriage to Brecken in a voice that was steady and unadorned. She did not dramatize. She recounted specific incidents with the precision of someone who had mentally cataloged them for years, knowing they might one day matter. When she described the 2010 statement, she thought she could call for help. That was her mistake. The courtroom shifted. It was not a gasp. It was a collective reorientation, dozens of people simultaneously understanding the kind of man they were looking at. Flagg's cross-examination was aggressive. He suggested Patrice was a disgruntled wife seeking revenge through testimony. Patrice responded that she had not initiated contact with the police and had cooperated only after being approached. She said she had nothing to gain personally from the trial and that her decision to testify had cost her the life she had built, however imperfect it was. Flagg did not pursue that line further. The medical examiner testified that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull and that the fracture pattern was inconsistent with accidental injury. The forensic anthropologist confirmed the identification through dental records. A blood spatter analyst explained the basement wall staining and its consistency with the type of injury described. A forensic accountant detailed the credit card cancellation timeline. Breckin Maddox did not testify. Flagg presented a defense built primarily on reasonable doubt, arguing the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the elapsed time, and the impossibility of establishing a precise sequence of events 2 decades after the fact. He called no witnesses. In closing, Keller stood before the jury and said that this case was about a woman who did everything right. She recognized danger. She called for help. She identified herself and her situation clearly and specifically. And the system that was supposed to protect her was instead operated by the man who threatened her and his colleague who chose loyalty over duty. She said Jolene Maddox had been failed by every institution that existed to keep her safe, and that the jury now had the opportunity to be the first institution that did not fail her. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. The verdict was guilty on both counts: first-degree murder and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Breckin Maddox stood when the foreperson read the decision and received it with the same blank composure he had worn his entire life, a mask so practiced it had become indistinguishable from his face. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. 2 weeks before sentencing, Virgil Henson, who had never been formally charged, contacted the prosecutor's office through his attorney and offered a proffer. He admitted that Breckin Maddox had called him the night of July 14th after Jolene's dispatch call and told him to ensure the call was suppressed. Henson said he contacted Curtis Wentz directly and instructed him not to dispatch a unit and not to create a log entry. He said he did this because Breckin was his partner and because he believed, at the time, that Breckin was dealing with a difficult domestic situation that did not require outside intervention. He said he did not know Breckin intended to harm Jolene. He said that after Jolene's disappearance, he understood what had likely happened but felt trapped by his own complicity. He said he conducted a deliberately shallow investigation to protect himself as much as Breckin. Henson was charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. He pleaded guilty to the obstruction charge in exchange for the conspiracy charge being dropped and was sentenced to 3 years in a federal facility, a consequence that Gemma Bridwell found grotesquely inadequate but legally inevitable. Breckin Maddox was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Gemma read a victim impact statement on behalf of her family. She described her father's decline and death. She described her mother, now 82, and living in an assisted care facility in Marlinton, who had been told that Jolene was found and who had sat in her wheelchair and said, "Bring her home." Gemma described the birthday card with the underlined "please" and said that every time she read it she heard her sister asking for something no one had given her, the basic human assurance that someone was coming to help. After the sentencing, Hale drove to Marlinton. He went to the assisted care facility and sat with Vera Bridwell for 20 minutes. He did not discuss the legal proceedings in detail. He told her that her daughter had been found and that the man responsible had been held accountable. Vera held his hand with both of hers and asked him to repeat it. He did. She nodded and closed her eyes, and Hale sat with her in silence until a nurse came to help her to dinner. Jolene Maddox was buried in the Bridwell family plot in Pocahontas County on a cool spring morning in 2017. Gemma, Daphne, and Vera were present. A small group of people who had known Jolene, Lissa Kane, Dale Odom, 2 former co-workers from the veterinary clinic, stood at the edge of the gathering. The minister read a passage about being gathered home, and Gemma placed a single photograph inside the casket before it was lowered, the candid shot of Jolene from the last family gathering, laughing at something outside the frame, her face open and unguarded in a way that had become impossible in the final months of her life. Patrice Maddox filed for divorce the week after the sentencing and moved to Martinsburg permanently. She changed her surname back to Nolan and took a position at a legal aid office, processing paperwork for protective orders. She told an interviewer from a regional newspaper that she did not consider herself brave. She said she had simply outlasted the thing that frightened her, and that survival, however imperfect, was its own form of testimony. Nora Phelps, the archivist who had found the tape, remained at the sheriff's office. She completed the full records audit over the following year and identified 11 other dispatch calls from the 1990s that had no corresponding log entries. None were connected to the Maddox case. All were documented and referred for review. The department implemented a digital dispatch logging system with redundant backups and automatic timestamping. It was a procedural correction that arrived 2 decades too late for the woman whose voice had finally, after 20 years of silence in a basement box, been heard.